On Wikipedia, the very earliest Oasis years are summed up with just one sentence. In 1991, bassist Paul McGuigan, guitarist Paul Arthurs, drummer Tony McCarroll and singer Chris Hutton formed a band called The Rain. Unsatisfied with Hutton, Arthurs invited and auditioned acquaintance Liam Gallagher as a potential replacement. There is, however, so much more than this to the story of that first early era of the band when they were called The Rain. And so today I want to start with the very earliest of Oasis origin stories, starting right at the beginning when they met as kids. The story of the Gallagher brothers' childhoods has already been told brilliantly in detail in the Supersonic documentary. So I want to start with one of the lesser known members of the band, bass player Paul McGuigan, or Guigsy as most people know him. Despite being one of the quieter and more reclusive members of the band, Guigsy, along with Bonehead, was absolutely central to the band's story right in the beginning. And I won't be telling his story alone, because today I am joined by his sister, Mary McGuigan, who makes comments throughout this video to set the record straight. And I must say a massive thank you to James from the Oasis podcast for helping that conversation to happen. I guess my first question to ask would be, would you rather I just repeat your words back, or can I use your voice?
Yeah. You can use my voice. I sound a bit like a Smurf, but I guess everyone hates their voice on recordings, don't they?
Mary McGuigan, Paul's younger sister, was there for pretty much everything, and she had just spent the day with Guigsy himself when she spoke to me. Oasis biographer Paolo Hewitt tells the story. Paul McGuigan was born in Manchester on the 9th of May 1971. His secondary school was Burnage High School, and this was an all-boys school, one of the biggest in the northwest. But a family tragedy interrupted Guigsy's schooling. When he was 8 years old, his father was diagnosed as having cancer of the stomach. The doctor gave him 6 months to live. Gerard died 4 years later. With the passing of his father, family life changed dramatically. If there was one lesson his parents gave their children, it was that in life you can do anything you want to. All you have to do is put your mind to it, because nothing is impossible. So Guigsy was just a young lad when his dad was diagnosed with cancer, and of course, as it would on anyone, this must have had an effect on him.
The timeline's definitely out there. So my dad died when I was 7 and I'm younger than Paul. My dad died in March 81. It was March of 81, so Paul would have been 9, he would have been 10 that year. And I don't remember a time when my dad didn't have cancer.
In his book The Truth, Oasis drummer Tony McCarroll tells the story of the time when he and Guigsy first met as youngsters in Manchester. In this story, Guigsy and McCarroll are both 12, and they are undergoing trials for a junior football team called the Northern Rebels. Tony tells it this way. The head coach sauntered over and started pointing and laughing at the group, singling out inadequacies as a way of determining which ones had the strongest character. His way of weeding out the less socially skilled or confident was brutal but effective, although he would probably be jailed for it nowadays. Next to me was a quiet lad who I recognised as he lived across the road from the local baths. He was a touch overweight, which led to some direct ribbing from the coach. I could clearly see that the insults were starting to have an effect on the poor lad, and so I whispered, "Tell him he's got big ears." The kid looked back with shock in his eyes. He seemed a touch unsure of my advice. There was an air of innocence about him. I knew that if he defended himself, the coach would respect him for it, and all would be well. Suddenly, he screamed at the top of his voice, his face exploding with rage, "Shut your stupid fucking face, you ugly jug-eared cunt." According to McCarroll, Guigsy was saved from a kicking from that coach by the intervention of another player, and from that point, he and Guigsy went on to be mates.
Oh my God. So Tony definitely didn't write that book. Yeah, there's words in there that Tony doesn't know how to spell. I can't imagine him taking any advice from Tony ever, would be my gut reaction. I don't know if it's true or not. I can't picture it, and I certainly can't picture his face exploding with rage. He did live opposite the swimming bath, so that bit was factually correct.
Okay,
and he was slightly overweight, so that is true.
But Tony McCarroll wasn't the only future band member that Guigsy was friends with. The other was a lad called Chris Hutton, who would be the singer in his band before being replaced by Liam Gallagher. Chris has a book called Don't Look Back in Anger, Growing Up with Oasis, and in it he tells his story. But before I read to you from this book, I need to make a quick little side comment. As I was trying to assemble the story of The Rain, Oasis in the early days, two of the best sources I had were Tony McCarroll's book and Chris Hutton's book. However, both of these books treat Guigsy as some kind of underhanded, calculating criminal almost. And this was the reason I wanted to get in touch with Mary McGuigan, because much of the stuff in these books is really interesting, it's really fascinating, but a lot of the anger that's aimed at Guigsy in both books doesn't really ring entirely true to me. It feels a little bit like sour grapes. Both of these books have been out there in the Oasis community for years, and they are very, very enjoyable reads. But when it comes to the, character assassination of Guigsy, you need to hear both sides of the story. You can't make a judgment with just one. And so I'm very happy again to bring Mary in to kind of correct the record in certain places with an opposing, balancing perspective. A lot of hardcore guys like me have read these books and come away thinking, God, man, he was cutthroat. But the more I've looked at it, the more I've gone, that is just sour grapes. The reason people have got that impression is there's no counterbalance.
I've not read either of the books because I knew that they wouldn't be honest. I also knew that neither of them were written by the people that said they wrote them. It'll be interesting to understand what has been said because I don't know any of it. I've just poured myself a pint, so, at least I'm prepared for this now. Go on.
Right. All right, here we go. This is what Chris Hutton says. At root, Oasis begins not with two brothers, but two best mates, Chris Hutton and Paul Guigsy McGuigan. The latter is now a metropolitan multimillionaire, enjoying the cushiest job any band member can have and able to summon up the delights of which one adolescently dreamt. The former remains in Manchester's suburbia, working long factory hours, his teenage fantasies long consigned to a far corner of his memory. They are no longer best mates, to say the least. The conception of the group Oasis sprang from these two boyhood friends' imaginations. The final realisation, however, depended on that friendship's brutal betrayal.
Good Lord. You got to root and I knew that Chris Hutton couldn't spell the word root, never mind anything else. Chris was a lovely lad. I've not seen him since the Rain split up. I've not seen him since.
Were they best mates? Did they have that real connection in the early days?
They were friends, but only friends that saw each other down the pub. His school friends that I knew from Burnage, 3 black lads. I don't remember anyone else other than those 3. But I don't remember Chris from school. I only remember Chris from after school when they were down at the pub.
Chris also mentions the change that came over Guigsy when his dad got diagnosed and how that affected their relationship. Guigsy would sometimes go weeks without emerging from his home. Chris knew that his dad's death when he was only 12 hit him harder than he let on, but it would be some time before he grasped the extent of the depressions that could strike Guigsy. While at school together at Burnage High School, Chris and Guigsy both shared in one of the wildest and most dramatic episodes in the entirety of Guigsy's life. If you wanted to demonstrate the concept of segregation to someone in the 80s, you only needed to show them around a northern inner city comp at break time. Guigsy was beginning to display alarming Thatcherite sensibilities. There's anecdotal evidence from all sides that ritualised skirmishing could be fun as hundreds of lads piled into each other without doing too much damage every break time. The laughter died the day a lower school white lad at Burnage High stabbed an Asian 13-year-old to death. Race relations at the school were never the same again as media, police and social services swarmed around the campus. The upper school, where knives and general weaponry were common currency, became a tinderbox waiting to explode. When an Asian upper school kid brought in a rejigged air gun, held it to a white boy's head and said, "This one's for you," dramatic repercussions were inevitable. The next morning, a lad called Jimmy cornered the gun toter and floored him with frightening ferocity. By home time, the word was out. It was coming to the flashpoint everyone had been building up to for weeks. The forces massed on Kingsway, Burnage's main thoroughfare, and bedlam ensued. Traffic screeched to a halt in both directions as scores of lads roamed up and down the carriageway, beating the shit out of each other. Drivers started getting out of cars to have a pop too. 2 Asians were still down once the smoke had cleared. The next day at school, 17 white lads were called out of roll call and taken off to be locked away from the rest of the kids. Among them were Chris and Guigsy, although Guigsy had been somehow absent from the mass ruck the previous night. The Burnage 17 ate their lunch alone after the rest of the school had gone to lessons. The dining room was glass-walled, completely open to the outside view, and with mounting horror the lads watched as dozens and dozens of Asians began to come up to the windows, making throat-slitting gestures and carrying weapons. Suddenly, seemingly within seconds, they were all inside, making good their threats. A maelstrom of chairs, tables, knives and glass swirled around the room as the hopelessly outnumbered whites ran for their lives. They ran for the tiny kitchen, barricaded themselves in behind the door, managed to put out a phone call through to one of the lads' dads, who was round the back of the kitchen with a van within minutes. They escaped into the van and sped off, swearing revenge. They tried to exact it the next day, but the escalation had brought a new element: police reinforcements. Almost 100 lads had marched to the school, swelled by a white influx from St Albans School, but as soon as they launched into the Asians in the yard, the police moved in. The Burnage 17 returned home to telephone calls informing them that they'd been expelled, Chris and Guigsy included. They'd be going to Shawbrook to do their exams and to court to defend their liberty.
I've never heard of the Burnage 17. They weren't a group of white lads. They were mostly black lads and a couple of white lads who were set upon by hundreds of Asian lads. It was horrific. And we went to the most racially inclusive primary school ever. You know, the first thing we ever learned to cook when we were at primary school were chapatis. I think we had people from 34 countries who spoke 15 languages. There was this one racist thug that went to primary school with me and Paul. When he went to Burnage, he did stab an Asian lad in the school playground, and Paul witnessed it. So he witnessed this poor lad get stabbed and bleed to death in the playground of the school.
Wow.
And I remember vividly him coming home and telling me about it and then telling me who it was. And then a few days later, there was an incident where the relatives of a lot of the Asian lads at Burnage School pulled up in transit vans. These weren't just students. These were older brothers, the cousins, the uncles, and did storm the school because apparently there was later found there was a hit list of, I don't know if it was 17 people. It might have been more. Most of the lads were suggested to leave school for their own safety. They weren't expelled. And so they tried to set up study groups in different areas of Manchester, and they moved it around so that they couldn't be discovered by this group of vigilantes. There were certainly times when they were due to have like a study group in a community centre, and these vigilantes found out where they were going. And so they would all have to run and leave. They would just all leg it in all different directions. The dinner ladies hid them in a storeroom. They locked them in a storeroom So they didn't escape in anyone's van or any of that. Two 60-odd-year-old ladies locked them in a storeroom and said, "Who? I don't know what you're talking about. We've never seen them." And basically saved their lives, because they'd have killed him. They would have killed him.
That must have. He seems like such a kind of a guy who does not thrive on drama and confrontation.
Yeah, he hates it. And that's why I laughed at the Thatcherite thing. I mean, that's just bollocks. It's just absolute bollocks.
Hutton says a few times that he wasn't full on BNP, but he was a Thatcherite conservative at heart.
Tell you what, give me 5 minutes with Chris Hutton and a pool cue. Honestly, Chris and Tony will know that Paul will have never read the books and will never ever read the books, so they get away with writing whatever they want. But Jesus.
Paolo Hewitt says this about the whole episode. The mothers of all the suspected children mounted a campaign, later successful, to have their children reinstated. 6 months later, a report, the Macmillan Report, exonerated Guigsy and his friends of all wrongdoing. And now I'm going to share one more childhood story with you guys before we move on to the music. This is the first time Tony and Guigsy properly encountered Noel Gallagher. After a quiet first weekend in the park, we arrived the following Friday evening with carrier bags full of grog from the local off-licence. After an hour or so, a firm of around 15 arrived in the park. Darkness had arrived, and with no one else around, they made their way towards us. They then made us an offer which we could not refuse. You've got a 60-second start. Get out of the park and get home. If we catch you before you reach home, we'll put you in hospital. Do you understand, you paddy bastards? This statement of intent was not good news to us, as we were mostly of Irish descent. I looked at Guigs, who was terrified by the prospect of a beating. We had seen this mob beat 2 young men under similar circumstances, leaving one in the Manchester Royal Infirmary. We all headed out of the park, intent on making it home. Through stealth and caution, we very nearly made it, but suddenly we stopped as a dark figure appeared at the bottom of the alley we were in. Upon meeting the end of the entry, I was surprised to see my would-be capturer was a lad I knew, called Noel. One of the friends with me also recognised Noel and said, "What the fuck are you doing trying to catch us? You're as Irish as the rest of us." "I'm English, I was fucking born here," replied Noel. "Yeah, and you're gonna die here as well if you don't move," the friend replied. Sure enough, Noel shuffled to one side and we burst past. I remember Noel whispering, "Don't let them catch you," as we did. So now, let's scroll forward a few years to early adulthood and the birth of the musical dream. Throughout their teenage years, both Chris Hutton and Guigsy were into music. Chris says this about their shared passion and what it taught him about Guigsy. Virtually every Saturday night for years, Guigs and Chris would crash at each other's places after a night out. The two would play their latest records, talk about lyrics and songs, and compare their evolving beliefs. And Chris began to learn more about the black areas of Guigsy's soul, the depressive and even suicidal tendencies which he felt as a teenager.
It's a lot of bollocks. Chris has never stayed at our house, ever. Ever. Even when my mum was on holiday, Chris wouldn't stay at our house. So it's like never. It's never happened. The loss of a parent would make you depressed. Yes, it does. It does. I totally get that. But certainly I can't get why Chris would know. The friendship was not that deep. Paul's a very private person, always has been, continues to be. Would not be telling his deepest, darkest secrets to many people, but certainly not to Chris Hutton. I cannot imagine a universe where that would happen.
By all accounts, the Milestone pub, which sadly no longer exists, was the birthplace of the very first seeds of the band that would become Oasis. However, there are multiple versions of who it was who actually started that ball rolling. This is Chris Hutton's version of events. April 16th, 1990. A scorching bank holiday Monday in the Milestone pub is as good a date as any to mark the birth of Oasis. Chris remembered Bonehead had some kind of musical history, a group called Pleasure in Pain. He also knew that Bonehead wasn't currently hooked up with anyone else. So Chris went up to him and said, "Bonehead, I'm forming a band. I'm going to do the singing and the lyrics, and I've heard you can play guitar. Do you fancy it?" Bonehead paused for half a second, broke into his trademark grin and replied, "Mad for it. In fact, I'll do anything except sing or write lyrics." Lurking in Bonehead's shadow stood Guigsy, open-mouthed. Had he not been there to witness the offer to Bonehead, it's unlikely Guigsy would ever have become involved in the band at all. Guigs, however, immediately saw the sliver of an opening, calculated the position and dived in within 5 seconds. "Chris, can I join as well?" "I'll do anything, Chris. Anything."
Oh my God, it's the greatest comedy ever written, isn't it? No, nonsense. No, nonsense. Just nonsense. Paul and Bone, there was only the two of them playing in Bone's dad's garage for weeks and weeks and weeks before they even attempted to get anyone else involved. They were just doing it for like shits and giggles, really. It was like just something to do. The reason they started The Rain was that Bone and Paul used to go to the pub together. The Milestone in Burnage is no longer there. They've knocked it down. They just got bored because there was nothing to do every night. When Bone said, "Why don't we start a band? I've got a spare bass guitar, you can borrow it, we can set up a band." The thought of Chris Hutton instigating anything is just beyond. The man is just beyond. This is a man that I have literally, quite honestly, seen sat on a bar stool, fall off it. And then when you said, "Are you all right, Chris?" he said, "What do you mean?" And he doesn't remember falling off the bar stool. Not pissed, not had a drink, just fell off the bar stool.
So that's just sheer bollocks then, his account.
Complete bollocks, yes.
In the Supersonic book, Bonehead tells it this way. "Friday night was pub night, so I got to know Chris and Guigs just through people in the pub. I said, 'We're going to form a band, do you want to be in it?' Guigs was like, 'What shall I do?' I said, 'Play bass, one note, dead easy. Chris can sing, get a microphone.' We plugged it in his garage and did it, badly, but it was great because all of a sudden Friday nights were Friday night in the garage, making a racket through one amp, and it was really good." Chris continues, "Despite not being able to play a note, Guigsy did the group a sterling first service by declaring that they could rehearse in his front room. For 6 weeks the lads laboured together. Bonehead's patience was exemplary as he guided Guigsy's novice fingers around his bass fretboard."
They needed somebody that was not afraid of standing up in front of a group of people and looking daft in case, if it all went shambolic. And it was shambolic. There were gigs that I went to where they only knew 3 songs and they played them 4 times, like on a loop. And one of them was The House of the Rising Sun.
The other was were they having a rave on the roof, which you helped write, I think?
Having the Rave on the Roof. Yep, me and our kid wrote that, sat in our living room.
What was the third track?
Wild Thing.
Wild Thing. So House of the Rising Sun, Rave on the Roof and Wild Thing, that was the gig set?
Wild Thing. That was the gig set and they played it 4 times. Quite frankly, there was me and Bonehead's sister that were there. Other than that, there were just like some locals in this random pub going, "The fuck is this?"
The whole band were massive Stone Roses fans and they had tickets to see them just 1 month later at Spike Island. Guigsy, Bonehead and Chris all went down together in Bonehead's specially squarified work van. Guigsy decorated Bonehead's van in garish psychedelic patterns and, along with other friends such as Tony French and Chris Hutton, they all piled into it in the summer of 1990 and took off to see the Stone Roses play in Spike Island. The following week, a picture of the van was printed in a local Manchester paper as part of their special on the event. The photographer was Michael Spencer Jones.
Yeah, it was me, Bone, Paul and John Hodgkinson, and we had fairy liquid bottles filled with emulsion paint and we were like flicking it on Bone's van and we hit quite a few cars as they drove past. Not our greatest moments.
Chris Hutton picks up the story after Spike Island, saying this: "Spike Island acted upon the lads like a 2-week course of amphetamines, driving them to rehearse harder, write more, tighten up and to get ambitious. But in Chris and Bonehead's minds niggled a tricky musical problem: Guigsys' bass playing. One afternoon, as Guigsy sweated over a bass run, Chris took the bass from him and rattled off the bass line himself without thinking. Bonehead broke into the ensuing pregnant pause with a cheery grin and said perhaps Chris should switch to bass. Chris laughed off the momentary embarrassment and handed back the instrument to a relieved Guigsy, saying, "Nah, he'll get it sorted, I'm staying singer." Guigs was Chris's mate and he wasn't going to dump him now.
No, Chris is not going to dump him now. He's going to dump all over him afterwards. Have you ever heard Chris Hutton sing? It's the worst thing you've ever heard in your entire life. It's dreadful. The man could not sing. He cannot hold a tune. Chris Hutton could not sing. He could not play a tambourine, never mind a bloody bass guitar.
At this time, the band was Bonehead, Guigsy, Chris and a drum machine, but the drum machine and the singer's days were both numbered. In Getting High, Paolo Hewitt also skims pretty quickly over the story of the Rain, just saying this: for the Rain's first gig, they put all their instruments through Bonehead's amp and used a drum machine to back them. Not long after that, they sacked Hutton, and then Liam Gallagher swaggered into their lives. So now let's take a look at first Tony McCarroll and then how Liam Gallagher did swagger into their lives. Tony tells the story of how he was recruited and the drum machine retired. Spring 1990, and it had been a couple of months since I'd last seen Guigs. He'd rung earlier that evening though and needed to see me urgently. I was sitting in a pub called The Church when I spotted Guigs slowly ambling up Stockport Road. Two people accompanied him, Chris Hutton and Bonehead. "We want you to drum for us," said Guigs before we had managed to sit down. "With the new Stone Roses," added Bonehead. Tony went to see them at a gig at the Milestone pub to make up his mind whether or not the band was for him. The show started and I began watching Guigs intently. He had told me that Bonehead had given him a crash course in bass playing, and, to his credit, he was there and he was actually playing along in time to the rest of the band. I was impressed. A couple of covers and an unmemorable original composition, and they were finished. I agreed to join the cause and rehearsals were arranged for the following week.
But that uninspiring original one would have been Rave on the Roof.
Now, I have to ask, do you have a recording of that song? Because there's no record. Do you have the lyrics to it or anything? Because it's lost to history. It's the first ever track that could be said this was the first ever Oasis song. You and Paul wrote it, and it's just lost in the mists of time.
I do know some of the words to it, but I'm not going to sing it for you.
Would you be willing to recite any of the lyrics to that song for us?
No, best not. They're best forgotten. It wasn't our finest hour.
Bonehead says, "We did a couple of gigs, we used a drum machine, the same beat for every song, and somebody just said, 'Look, I know a guy, Tony McCarroll.' I didn't know Tony, but he played drums, so we had a drummer then. It was a racket, it was crap, but it was brilliant as well." And even though Noel Gallagher joining the band doesn't actually come into this story, they already had designs on him from that early stage. Guigs told me that local lad Noel Gallagher had got a job with the Inspiral Carpets as a guitar tech and was touring all over the globe, which seemed pretty impressive and explained his recent absence. Noel had played his acoustic guitar in the park for us and he wasn't bad. Guigs and Hutton were keen to get him on board with the band.
I mean, I'd always known Liam. I knew Liam from about the age of 9. He would come to our house and I knew who Noel was. I didn't know him. When you're knocking about in the park, we would see him because we knew that he was the guy that had met the Smiths.
But it would be a while before either Gallagher brother joined, and it would be Liam who joined first. At this time, a young Liam Gallagher had a job valeting cars working for longtime friend of the band, Paul Ashby, also known as Biggin. Biggin was fond of Liam and also friends with Bonehead, and he would often talk to his young employee about Bonehead and his band. In his book, Biggin says, "I'd often talk of Bonehead to Liam, and when I mentioned going to watch this new band, he was extremely eager. He already knew Tony, the drummer, but wasn't aware that he had joined. The following Thursday we were there early. As we entered, I spotted Tony McCarroll at the bar, and he bought us both a drink. After a 30-minute set, I was suitably impressed, and I could see that Liam was engrossed by it all." Liam was looking forward to meeting Bonehead after hearing so many hilarious stories about him. Unfortunately, due to a misunderstanding regarding the owner of 2 drinks we were hurriedly slurping, an argument ensued and we had to leave early. Tony McCarroll gives us his view from the stage. "Suddenly, the door opened and a young Liam Gallagher swaggered in. As usual, heads turned at the sight and sound of him. He walked in front of Biggin, talking very loudly over his shoulder to his large friend behind. I was standing at the bar when Liam spotted me. 'Have a fucking good one tonight, Tony,' he said. We're having a rave on the roof was in full swing as I became distracted by Liam and Biggin at the side of the stage, arguing with 2 large red-faced men who had accused them of stealing their pints. After a few heated words, and I'm sure physical threats, the accusers made off, leaving Liam and Biggin to smile and raise their stolen pints in my direction. Chris Hutton, however, was less pleased to see Liam at the gigs and found his presence and his focus a little bit unsettling. There had been one moody lad in the audience the band recognised, Liam Gallagher. He never said a word to the band, but Chris noticed the hard stare, rarely leaving him as he prowled around the stage. The Rain would be seeing more and more of Liam over the next year, a brooding presence at the foot of their stages, taking mental notes. The band continued to rehearse and gig for a year from that point, but Chris Hutton's position in the band was becoming more and more questionable. According to Tony McCarroll, Guigsy was one of the loudest voices calling for his removal. We got on well as a group of people and had become tight-knit as a band, but Guigs wasn't happy. Hutz isn't doing enough to be a lead singer, he said. It was decided after an exhausting 6 gigs that we should take a breather. It was obvious that Guigs had ideas about replacing Hutz that didn't sit well with me.
My understanding was that everybody was saying Chris isn't cutting it. Because he couldn't sing, he couldn't hold a tune. Every note was flat. He could not hold a tune, God love him. Everybody was saying it, but whether it was Paul that said it to his face, I don't know.
Chris Hutton also seems to believe that Guigsy was at the heart of the plot to remove him from the band. When the Rain turned up to play at the boardwalk, watching from the front again was Liam Gallagher, all studied concentration and brow-heavy glower. The band expected him to be there now. Liam had taken to coming down to rehearsals, where he never said much, but the band just got used to having him around. Once or twice, Chris would come back from the bar and find Liam had cornered Guigsy or Bonehead. What were they talking about? The lads would shrug non-committally. Only much later, when it was too late, did Chris guess what Liam had been up to. Tony claims to have not been involved in these conversations and said he was just told about it by Bonehead in a phone call. We've got someone who wants to join the band as the lead singer, said an excited Bonehead on the phone. It's Liam Gallagher. Has anybody told Hutz? I asked. Guigs is going to do it, replied Bonehead.
I suspect it's because he was always the peacemaker. He was everybody's mate. You'll put it right. If you say it to them, you'll say it nicely. I think so. I suspect that he was given the task of being the spokesman.
So it seems that Guigsy was given the position of spokesman for the band. Because he was quite a peacekeeper, he was asked to have the conversation with Chris. But Chris seemingly realised that something wasn't right after coming off stage at one of their final gigs as the Rain. As they came off stage, Chris looked round for his mate Guigs, ready to go off for a drink session. Over in a corner, he could see Guigs and Liam, seemingly in urgent conversation. They looked somehow foreign to him, conspiratorial even. He headed for the bar. Eventually, Guigs showed up for a bottle or two. "All right, Paul?" inquired Chris. For a second, Guigs looked blank, cold, straight through him, like he wasn't there. Guigsy muttered something, looking down at the floor. Chris had been with Guigs through too many mood swings and depressions in his life not to know when to back off. But there was something in Guigsy's stone-hard expression that was new to him. The bar felt colder now. Chris went home. According to Hutton, he and Guigsy had been best mates, hanging out most days up until this point, and he says that from this point onwards, Guigsy started avoiding him. And again, according to Hutton, eventually he rang Guigsy, who told him not that he was fired, but that the band was splitting up. This is how Hutton reports that conversation. Chris asked Guigsy on the phone, "What about the band's next rehearsal?" Guigsy said, "I think we're splitting up. This isn't going to work out unless we're all 100% on the dole and ready to tour the country full time." "All right," Chris replied, "we'll do it. I'll sack the job, we'll get it together full time." "You can't do it," said Guigsy. "You're getting a mortgage."
No, Chris didn't have a job. Paul had a job. Tony had a job. Bonehead was a plasterer to work for himself. But Chris didn't have a job. Paul only gave up his job way later, when Noel had said, we need to rehearse more. And that's when Paul gave up, that's when Paul took redundancy, because I told him to follow his dreams and take redundancy. And my mother never let me forget it, because she said I was ridiculous and he should have kept a proper job.
Chris had that draining feeling at the pit of his stomach, but he knew none of this was right. It just wasn't on the level. "What are you lot going to do then? Are you just sacking music forever?" asked Chris. Too evenly, Guigs recited, "I'm going to learn the bass properly. Tony's joining an Irish folk band, and Bonehead needs to earn some money as his guitar just got repossessed. I've got to go, Chris. I'm off to training. I've not got time to discuss this." Chris decided to go round to Bonehead's house and have it out. He turned into Bonehead's road and then froze. There outside the driveway was Guigsy's car. Bonehead's Mrs. Kate answered the door, surprised by the identity of the visitor. Chris headed for the back room, the scene of many a band session. As he stood in the doorway, two familiar blushing faces looked up at him, Guigs and Bonehead. An awful pause, stomach tightening and intense. "I thought you were going to training, Paul," remarked Chris softly. Liam's older brother Paul picks up the story. Liam's opportunity came when a local band called The Rain sacked their lead singer. There's not a lot I can say about The Rain. I only heard them once and they were pretty feeble. They had one song in their set about the Strangeways prison riot in Manchester called "We're Having a Rave on the Roof." They played a few inconspicuous gigs, but they were going nowhere. Then Chris Hutton left. Liam saw this as his big opportunity. Liam got in touch with Bonehead, Guigsy and Tony and arranged an audition. Liam says, "I was impressed because they were in a band and I wanted to be in a band. So then some lad came over to me and said, 'They've sacked Chris, who was their singer.' And then they asked, 'Do you want to go down and meet them?' I said, 'Yeah, go on, I'll give it a go.' So I did, and they liked it." And the nameless lad who apparently suggested to Liam going to audition for The Rain was actually his employer, Paul Ashby, Biggin. Biggin also drove him to the audition, accompanied him and supported him throughout. And although in his book Tony seems to imply he wasn't really involved, he nonetheless actually participated in auditioning Liam. Because there were two parts to the audition, one at Bonehead's house and one at Tony's. The weekend after, I and one nervous-looking Liam Gallagher headed over to visit Bonehead and Kate. I rapped on his front door and was greeted by Bone, who welcomed both me and Liam inside. And so it began. Bonehead pulled out an acoustic guitar, and after much shuffling of feet and nervous twitching, Liam opened his mouth and began to sing. I looked at Bonehead, who smiled and gave me an approving nod. Soon after, myself, Liam and Bonehead drove over to visit Tony, the drummer. Tony picks up the story saying, "A rather nervous-looking kid appeared. Liam. But shit, he looked the part. He stood rather sheepishly at the living room door. Then, all of a sudden, he jerked forwards as Biggin put his hand in the small of his back and pushed firmly. Bonehead hadn't brought a rhythm guitar, so he picked up a battered, out-of-tune bass that I had lying in the back room. My drums were at the rehearsal room, so I made do with a set of bongos. It had to go down as one of the most unprepared, unprofessional and useless auditions ever. But then again, we finished with one Liam Gallagher as our frontman, so maybe it was the best. Liam says, "They liked it, and they went, 'Right, do you want to be in this band?' I said, 'Yeah, but we'll have to change that fucking name though, because it's terrible.' And we changed it to Oasis, and that was that. So, for the record, I was never in a band called The Rain."
Yeah, it felt different when Chris had gone, because Chris would forget the words mid-song. He would forget the words, even to like Wild Thing. It was like a different vibe once Liam was on board. So yeah, it felt completely different.
Chris was out and Liam was in, but it seems that throughout the whole process, Chris bore the most resentment towards Guigsy. Chris accepted an invite to a mate's birthday party at the end of the month at the Milestone, knowing that there would be a good chance Guigs and Bonehead would be in attendance. Sure enough, his ex-bandmates were there. Guigsy was evasive, coy and slightly nervy. Hours of pot smoking later, the two found themselves alone in the street, heading for home. Chris broke the painfully awkward silence. "What's been going on, Paul?" Guigs kept utterly silent, staring at some convenient fixed point in the distance. "Well, are you going to say anything or what?" No, he wasn't. So, for 10 minutes, Chris let out everything, all the anger, hurt and resentment. If Guigs felt any guilt, it went completely unexpressed. He took it all in silence. Spleen vented and energy drained, Chris went home. It would be 6 months before they even spoke again. It's easy to hear stories like these and feel compelled to kind of take a side. For me personally, it just looks like it was a bunch of young lads who were not trained diplomats trying to navigate the choppy waters of being in a band. It can't be easy to have been in a band with someone, to have been kicked out and then see them go on to be megastars. So I do kind of understand some of the bitterness that Chris Hutton and Tony McCarroll felt. I don't, however, really agree with the character assassination of Guigsy.
He is a bit of a raster at heart. He kind of does believe in that whole philosophy, which is why the Thatcherite right-wing thing really frustrated me. A lot of his friends are rasters. He's got a lot of friends who make dub reggae music. When he left the band, he did quite a bit of producing and he managed a dub reggae band for a while. So that's kind of his vibe. Like, his wife is a yoga teacher, so they live this really sort of chill life that is so far removed from everything that I've just heard you tell me. There's not an aggressive bone in his body unless you were going to threaten his family. Paul's handy if he needs to be. He used to be an amateur boxer, and he only didn't go semi-pro because me and my mum begged him not to, because we didn't want to see him get hit in the face. It was just too much. But he was good. He was a good boxer. He likes a quiet life, and that's the life he lives now. Good God, all he does is his garden. He's a gardener. And I can't remember where I read it. I don't know if it was Paolo Hewitt that said it or if it was Jill Furmanovsky. But somebody said you can just sit in silence in his company for hours and hours and it feels right. That's just who he is. He's just like a calming influence.
You mentioned to me as well in one of our messages that he's very much someone who actually, far from turning on Tony McCarroll and Chris Hutton, actually stuck up for them.
Yeah, he did. I remember vividly when it was coming to crunch time for Tony, all of the band had said, "Look, To, we don't want you to go, but you do need to take drumming lessons. So we've arranged drumming lessons with this person. You just need to go." And he wouldn't go to them. And Paul kept saying to him, "If you don't go, they're going to get rid of you. You just need to do it, mate." And he wouldn't do it. And it came to the crunch and it ended in him losing his position. And then it all got very bitter when he took them to court and sued them and all of that went on. Yeah, it's just a shame that they've become so bitter about it. I get it. You know, I'm sure Pete Best is the same.
Well, Mary, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. It's great to talk to you. And please pass along love to Paul from me and all my viewers.
I will do.
All the best.
Thanks. Take care.